Tim, I am glad to have you on the podcast. This is such an interesting chain where I post on LinkedIn, and there's been some times you've liked my posts, and I've appreciated that. And then I recorded an episode with Tim Yu. We end up talking about Louis Tompros, who was a mutual connection, and then I followed up with Louis because it's been a while. And then I recorded an episode with him. You liked that post, and then I just messaged you to say, hey, I've been interested in your work, and thanks for taking a look at this episode. And we started talking from there. So this is what I love about the podcast, and I appreciate you being part of this chain reaction of people and their ideas.
No, I'm delighted to be here. I find it fascinating that in this world that we work in, there's often 1 degree of separation from just about everybody who's doing this. So Lewis's episode really caught my eye, and I've just generally been following what you've been doing out there. I think you've been doing a really great job of helping educate associates on the market about what matters. And I found that really interesting.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And for sure, plenty of your peers listen to this too. What I've discovered through this podcast is that at every seniority, lawyers are, I think we use the word mentorship for junior lawyers primarily, but I think the words explicitly that even senior lawyers have used that they're looking for is mentorship, because people always look for mentorship in new domains other than, where they feel they have their expertise. But yeah, so for sure, plenty of associates listen to this, but then plenty of partners like yourself too. So I want to start with, we have a number of interesting topics that we have honed in on, but one thing that I think is interesting is you are a trial lawyer and you have technical expertise, and you sit at the intersection of those two. And I wonder if we can talk about, in your practice, how you allocate attention and resources to building in each of these, and why not more of one than the other? Let's say primarily trial or primarily technical. Why the blend? I wonder if we can start with that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I find that in my practice, sort of where I sit at my level of seniority, they're not really in tension. And the reason is because in order to put on that strong trial presentation, I really need to understand the technical merits at a core level. You run into some lawyers that practice outside of the patent litigation context that I've heard some people say, you're never going to beat an expert at their own game, right? Because you're never going to know more than them. When it comes to the work that we do, I actually think that in many cases, when it comes to the subject matter of what's in dispute, whether it's about your accused products or whether it's about the prior art that anticipates, you should have a command of that better than these hired experts who aren't living it day to day, such that you can use them as a punching bag at trial. I mean, that's often the witness. The other side's technical expert is often the witness with whom you score the most points. But you can only do that if you have a complete command of the technical record. And so the technical piece, I end up sort of ingesting just in order to feel like I have the foundation to litigate the case aggressively on that axis. When you're more junior, I think you do have to think a little bit more about how am I going to allocate my time, right? In part because when you're less experienced with trial, you have to spend a whole bunch more time thinking about how to do things for the first time. And that's where you end up with more tension between, am I going to invest my time really making sure I understand this technical subject matter through and through? Or am I going to really learn how to do a super tight impeachment with a deposition transcript, right? I think that in many respects, my perspective on how to reconcile that tension is, look, if you're headed to trial, it's the time. Trials are sufficiently infrequent in our line of business that you just got to sort of put in the extra 50% and get both of those sort of really down solid. And don't be shy about leaning on your colleagues to help you, right? Because oftentimes talking to a more experienced lawyer, you can sort of take that prep down whether it's learning about the technical subject matter or learning how to do the trial mechanics, you can shorten that time by 50% or more. And so I think it's really important to be strategic about reconciling those tensions, because both are absolutely critical to practicing at a high level, especially at trial.
I think something I'm interested in exploring the podcast is other strategies that can work. I think in any context, among high-level performers, you can come up with different strategies that are all there's like this equilibria that works for everyone, right? And different people can exist in context, different approaches exist in context of each other. An easy way to think about that is as an equilibrium is driving down the street. It's an equilibrium for everyone to be on the right side, no matter what side you're going on. Can you talk through other approaches, like what would it look like, or what have you seen for success for someone who's taken a technical first approach or a trial first orientation? You have articulated a strong basis for why that intersection works for you. What have you seen in terms of success for these other two strategies?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think you can play a really important role specializing, essentially. I think that's basically what you're getting at, right? Is there room to specialize on the technical side or specialize in the trial piece? And absolutely, right? On the trial side, I have a colleague, Ramsey Fisher, who, he's this 8th year associate, but he's done 9 trials, I think, and including doing openings, and so he's very much a trial specialist. I use him as an example. I think the way it's worked out for him is that, given all his trial experience, he can jump on any trial team and provide like huge value add in any aspect of the trial, even if he's hopping on last minute, where it's much less important for him to have the really deep technical foundation that some of our other team members have. And it ends up being sort of like a Captain America type situation where you've got a variety of different people with, a range of skills, and you end up assembling a team where the sum of those skills is highly complementary. And so Ramsey ends up sort of being able to put together, he often puts together the closing before we even start trial, which is incredibly helpful for ensuring that all of your witness examinations build up the evidence that you're going to need in your closing. And he's able to do that because, maybe he doesn't have to spend as much time in the technical leads because there's other people on the team for whom that's going to be faster and who are providing that set of skills to the table. So that's an example of someone I've seen succeed in specializing on the trial piece. I will say, once folks get more senior, if you sort of look at the people who are, the very best trial lawyers out there, what I have found is that relatively few are consistently successful if they sort of brush aside the technical weeds and say like, oh, like technical person, go figure that out, right? Because going back to our earlier discussion, if the expert sort of takes you down, it's a lot easier for an expert to sort of dance around you if you don't have a complete understanding of how to shut down all the exit paths. You can only do that if you understand the technical record pretty deeply. But I think Ramsey's found a really nice niche where it works for him. And to be sure, like, he very much ingests the technical record at the level necessary for what he's doing, but it doesn't have to be quite as deep as the person who's going to cross the technical expert. And then on the other side of the equation, if you're talking about somebody who's the technical specialist, I think that what's important, I've certainly seen that work effectively. I think what's really important, however, is that as a technical specialist, you're not shy about really trying to understand deeply how to effectively communicate things at trial. Because otherwise, when you're taking the deposition of the technical expert, for example, you don't have enough context to ask the questions in a way that's going to be super digestible for the jury, such that your deposition questions and the answers there too can serve as tight control, right? If you're in the technical weeds in your deposition at a level that you'd never cross-examine the expert at trial, then you're getting all this control that's not really that going to be that helpful at trial, because you're going to be addressing the subject matter at a totally different level of granularity. The net of all of this is I do see room for specialization, and I've seen it be very effective. But whether you're specializing in the technical subject matter or at the trial piece, it's super important to be educated and mindful of the other side of the equation.
That's helpful. And so I'm also wondering, what is, if you choose specialization in either trial or technical expertise or a blended approach, what are each of these a bet on?
That's a good question. And look, I think my mind is perhaps overly focused on this just because, we at the firm have been thinking a ton about what AI is going to do the practice of law. But I think in a lot of respects, it's a bet on how this practice is going to play out in the next 2 to 5 year horizon. What I mean by that is, I think that no matter what level you're at in your practice, it's worth thinking about, what aspects of my practice are likely to be displaced by AI, whether it's stuff that you would be doing or stuff that people on your teams would be doing. And it does seem to me, right, this is all pretty preliminary, but it does seem to me that in terms of displacement, we're going to see that happen much slower in the trial context. Federal judges tend to be resistant to technology, right? We still don't have cameras in the courtroom in most places, right? And it's hard to see robots putting on trials in the next 5 years, right? Like, there's going to be trial lawyers doing that. And on the other hand, it's pretty easy for me to see AI, especially, the generation that will be out 3 to 5 years from now, AI tools that can do a really solid draft of a deposition outline for technical expert, or a really solid draft of a technical expert report. I mean, even now, there are AI tools, Crane Patent's one of them, that can build out invalidity contentions if you just ingest prior art into it, right? And if it can do that, it's not that far away from drafting a technical expert report. And so bringing us back to your question, I think that in a lot of respects, you're betting on what work is going to be available going forward, what clients are actually going to be willing to pay for going forward, where the alternative to paying for, humans to spend 300 hours drafting an expert report is to have AI do 80% of the work and maybe have humans do 50%. And then what does that mean in terms of how many people with technical specialization you need on these teams, and how much work they're going to have to do in any given case? I think that's really what you're betting on, or at least that's one axis in which you're placing bets.
I wondered if the trial lawyer versus technical expertise were bets on the kinds of client relationships and teams you found yourself as part of, because it sounds like the example you gave of your colleague, somebody with trial expertise can be brought into a variety of matters. So you're a bet on other people bringing in trial matters that you can jump on. And maybe the technical expertise is a bet on being tech savvy. Okay, maybe it's not, let's say historically it was, hey, I really understand the technology. Maybe in the construct you're using of what might happen in the next 2 to 5 years, that part becomes less necessary. But what remains necessary is clients know me to be able to have technical mastery or be able to manage the technical mastery aspect. And so I am more client facing because clients in a given vertical know to come to me for this expertise. Does that resonate? I'm trying to understand in terms of other ways to look at the bet that you're making is the kind of platform you're at, the teams you're a part of, the client relationships you have. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Because look, I talked about the AI tools creating drafts of things. You're still absolutely going to need lawyers to review it for all sorts of reasons, even sort of as we see the rate of hallucinations go down. The way I was thinking about it in the context of the bet we were just talking about is I just think there's less volume of work, right? So I think there's going to be probably a need for fewer of those specialists. But I think you're right. Like, there's still going to be a huge role for them, and I think it's going to put a premium on people who actually, I think, have that blend of maybe being a technical person as your primary strength, but having enough reps with trial so that you can understand sort of how to tell the technical narrative in a way that's going to be compelling for trial. And the reason I think that is likely to be sort of how this shakes out is, um, you know, you're going to have, I expect, um, less of a role for like all the technical people that would be doing these drafts in the first instance. There's the clients are going to be looking for people who can sort of do prompt engineering essentially to really get the AI to focus on what matters. You're absolutely going to have the you're going to need to have the technical foundation to do that prompt engineering. I think in two respects. One of them is you're going to have to redirect the AI tools when they're marching down the wrong path, and you can only do that well if you have the good technical foundations. But I think the other piece is if you're one of these technical people that has trial experience, you can also sort of do your prompt engineering in a way that elicits, you know, responses that are going to be more usable with the jury. Now, and then the third piece is I do think the highly technical people tend to have a competitive advantage when using these AI tools to begin with, right? For the most part, especially if they're sort of technical in software, those are the people who are like really sort of working on the bleeding edge use of AI. And I think that I wouldn't be surprised if you end up seeing people who are specialists and can hold themselves out to clients as specialists in leveraging AI most effectively to get the most value for the client, and be able to sort of have a better ratio of use of AI tools to use of human hours, and also be able to extract more quality out of the AI tools. So I could certainly see folks placing bets in that respect. It's like, how can I position myself as someone who's the most effective or among the most effective at leveraging AI to provide extreme client?
Normally, I'm not someone to make. I think everyone is making a bet on something. I think I am, but through my work, making predictions about the future, for instance, about the durability of patent litigation. Sure. So yes, everyone's doing that, but I also, that aside, try not to make lots of predictions about the future. But I can tell that you like doing that. So I'm curious, because that's definitely been a recurring theme in our conversation. So is that just like disposition, or is that just it's interest and fine, things may evolve a certain way, maybe they don't? Because it seems to me that you are focused on evergreen skills, like you're saying, the trial lawyer work. Like as you say, it's really hard to picture a robot in the courtroom anytime soon. So it seems like you're focusing on evergreen skills. For you, what do you find the utility of prediction? Um, you know, because you're doing so many things that could be just evergreen, and obviously, who knows how things pan out? Like, tell me about the role that prediction plays in how you approach your work.
Totally. And I will just, as a general matter, I don't have a strong inclination to being like, oh, I know what's going to happen in the future, right? I think I find myself at this fascinating inflection point where it's become clear to me and my colleagues that the practice of law is going to change drastically in the next 2 to 5 years. And it's going to continue to change in years 5 to 10, right? And this is therefore extremely top of mind for me, because I think what we're going to see is, for the law firms that did not figure out how to make effective use of AI, like we may well see a bunch of those law firms fail, right? Because one thing I think we can be pretty sure about, even if we're like fairly adverse to engaging in prediction, is clients are going to be driving for like the very best value, and that's going to be like a persistent factor in all of this. And where it is also become clear that AI tools are capable of cutting thousands of hours off of the time you're going to have to spend on a case. Maybe not right this minute, maybe not for every client, but we're really sort of on the cusp of that. And so that's part of why I'm more willing to engage in this, because, every week I'm thinking about what bets do we want to place to the framework you were talking earlier, to ensure that we're best positioned 1, 2, 3 years down the road. Because the last thing I want to see is, us being, I think, taking more of a wait and see approach. Because I think you're just going to be, you're going to be far too late, in part because I think the people who are likely to be most successful in leveraging AI are the folks who've used it enough to figure out, like, what is it especially good at? What is it less good at? Additionally, I think that if you're using these, if you have various folks within the firm exploring different uses of AI, and then have a process for making sure that the effective uses are communicated throughout the practice group, you're just going to see extreme gains that way. Bottom line is, like, I don't want to be the person, 5 years from now who missed the boat, and then all of a sudden you have this urgent situation where it's like, how are we going to keep everybody, employed in doing the sort of cutting edge patent litigation and other IP work they really, really enjoy doing? Because, like, we didn't leverage the AI tools. We didn't figure out how to drive extreme client value, and now the clients are looking elsewhere. That's really why I'm much more willing to engage in prediction around these topics these days.
And so something I wonder, there's this book, Co-opetition, that I read years ago that I still revisit now and then, about game theory in business. And part of it talks about ironic consequences of different parts of an ecosystem. And so an ironic consequence of technology, there's ironic applications of technology where, from the book cites a data point that paper usage, after computers became more prevalent, paper usage actually went up because it became easier to generate printed documents like the ones behind you.
Right. Exactly.
So then the easiest thing I can think of that, I'm the post the e-discovery phase, post, I think I was somewhat early to the Westlaw adoption phase, based on my vintage. And let's say with Westlaw, I think there's a pretty clear, I don't know how much it costs firms in terms of costs, what it impacts compared to, going through a bunch of books, which would seem, I think, would probably be cheaper. But of course, it makes research much more efficient and more high powered. But then I think a clearer case of ironic consequences is e-discovery, because my understanding, everyone said, oh, well, obviously this will drive down discovery costs, but it made it easier to process more and more discovery, right? And so I wondered, in your example of your technical experts, yes, in the universe we're operating in today, that same finite amount of technical subject matter will be digested and require less raw time. But then maybe what we could do is increase the capacity for what kinds of technical data we're digesting, and then just the problem actually, the costs therefore actually expand. So I don't know. Those are thoughts that I have about the difficulty of making predictions, because there are these ironic consequences. But I don't know if you had exposure to that in the course of your practice.
Look, in the econ space, we often call these unintended consequences, and like they happen. It happens all the time, right? It happens all the time. No matter how much focus you put on trying to figure out how the chips are going to fall on something, something completely unexpected happens, either because you made some sort of incorrect prediction about human behavior, or there was just this additional variable that you didn't identify. And that's always the risk in prediction. In terms of this question of whether, there's a possibility that the efficiencies driven by AI will end up motivating people to do even more technical analysis because it tries down the cost. Look, I think that's possible. I'm skeptical, and the reason I'm skeptical is because I think at some point you relatively quickly hit diminishing returns within any given case on the sort of additional sort of granular technical analysis. To be very clear, and we've talked about this previously, like I'm a strong believer that on the technical side, it's really useful to go deep and to do that early. But what I'm saying is once you've done that, further refinement is pretty incremental, in part because it is really hard to get judges and juries to focus on the extremely granular, extremely esoteric. I think they have a tendency to be like, okay, what's the bottom line? Which completely makes sense, right? Humans sort of are conditioned to be efficient decision makers. And I think, therefore, you're quickly going to hit diminishing marginal returns on doing that incremental technical analysis. Now, I do think that one thing we could see is even if on any given case, the amount of technical analysis necessary to be done by humans is going to go down a bunch, I expect we'll see an increase in the volume of cases because of a variety of factors, including, policies from the current administration, but also if you can get AI to do infringement analysis in like 10 minutes, that would take a patent engineer, a week, right? I think we're going to see more and more patent lawsuits. The cost of putting together a Rule 11 worthy complaint is going to go down to, I think, probably a tenth of what it has been historically, sort of outside of situations where you need to do like reverse engineering and SEM analysis of, the inside of a semiconductor package. But like setting aside that, where you actually have to sort of go out in the physical world and do work, the time it'll take to put together those complaints is going to go down drastically. The time it's going to take the plaintiff's lawyers to litigate those cases is going to go down drastically. And so if you zoom out from any given case, I could see a world in which there's an increase in technical analysis that's happening sort of at a macro level. It's hard for me to see that netting out in sort of a need for more humans to do that technical analysis, but we'll see, right? Because as you say, all the time we sort of fail to observe some factor that's going to drive an unintended result. And so I'm curious to see how that all plays out.
I can see what's so fun about making predictions, because then you just start making other predictions on top of predictions. So I'm like, okay, so let's say you see all these more matters. Maybe federal judges be a lot more amenable to getting rid of a case on 101, right away, right? Like you can just start to see just, okay, well, then what, and then what, and then what. That's fun. Okay, so let me ask you this. Going back to, the technical analysis thing, the diminishing returns is interesting. Something I was thinking about when you were saying this earlier is, I'm starting to think in terms of the previous episodes as this like ongoing dialogue among practitioners. And so one of the meta narratives of the podcast is approach to jury work. And what's the thesis there? Like, what is your core thesis? Let's say recently we had Neil Chatterjee back on, and so something he talked about is, his current approach is really driven by credibility. So his thesis is that why we have the Seventh Amendment, why we have juries for matters involving damages, is that these juries are best positioned. It's not because they're technical experts and able to digest, the operations of a semiconductor. It's because they are experts in credibility. They're able to use their human experience to evaluate and, look a technical expert in the eye or see if they're not looking in the eye. And so that's why I wondered if ultimately, fine, we can propose the concept of a robot, providing some sort of analysis in the courtroom on a technical level. But ultimately, what we need in this legal system is we have parties, and these parties have representatives who speak to the credibility of the positions of these parties. And so that's really what we're evaluating in the courtroom is things like credibility. But I think that ties into your thesis on juries and maybe you have some thoughts on what I just said, but otherwise we can start talking about jury approach. If you have a high level take on your approach to juries, because I actually asked another specific question based on something you said earlier.
Yeah, so I think Neil's absolutely right. Credibility is huge, and I think about that concept in a slightly broader way, which is just like overall, how do you present as a human? Because in addition to credibility, things that matter are you respectful, right? Are you following the rules? One recent example is, and it's something I've been focused on because I have this trial coming up in front of Judge Gilstrap's court, but Apple had a trial in front of Gilstrap, and I think Irel was on the other side. And I was following the trial in part because I'm thinking about there was some overlap with my case in terms of the sort of how the parties look. And it was the third time they were trying the case, I believe, because it had been up to the federal circuit a couple times. The first two times resulted in, infringement verdicts of hundreds of millions of dollars. This most recent trial was a complete defense verdict. And when I was talking to our Texas co-counsel about this, what ended up being a huge driving factor was just the sort of how respectful or maybe, not entirely respectful the various witnesses and lawyers were. Because the jury ended up making judgments pretty early on. It's like, who's respecting the judge, right? From the jury's perspective, the judge is the person who demands the most respect in the courtroom. And so if you're not respecting the judge, they're going to draw inferences about sort of what you think about yourself. Witnesses who couldn't answer questions without throwing in their own word, right? I don't think they necessarily viewed the witness as a liar, but I think they viewed the witness as someone who's an advocate. And you don't want juries to view your fact witnesses as an advocate. They're going to view the experts that way no matter what. They're hired guns. But you really want them viewing the fact witnesses as someone who's just there because they have something relevant to say to the case, and they're just telling you the facts as they are so that the jury can make the decision. The jury's been told that they're the ones who get to make the decision. They're going to, I think, we see it time and time again. They tend to discount fact witnesses who's come off as advocates. So, like I said, Neil's absolutely right. Credibility is huge, but I think of that as even a broader concept. Like, what are all the other meta factors that your witness is going to have beyond the words that come out of their mouth and go onto the transcript? Because those are often going to be what drive the jury's decision making.
Mm-hmm. Earlier, when you were talking about work in a jury context, use the word controlling earlier, controlling, directing, and then you also used the phrase closing off the exits. And so I thought there was an interesting, I'm noticing a pattern. And so how do you view what your role is heading into a trial? Like there's all the things you do in a case heading to trial, and what you do in trial. Is this controlling, directing metaphor? Is this more chess than poker? Like, how do you think about what your function is for accomplishing objectives for the client?
Great question. I think it depends a lot on the particular task you're engaged in at trial. And what I mean by that is, I was speaking about controlling and closing off closing off exits in the context of cross-examining the other side's expert. And in that context, like that's 100% what you have to do, because in order to score points on he or she, you really have to know exactly what they're going to say in response to your question. And in order to do that, you have to have shut down the exits, either through logic or through some sort of prior testimony or document that you use to impeach them. It goes back to the credibility thing, right? If you can get the expert to say something that's inconsistent with the record, like that's how you're scoring points. In other contexts, I much prefer the jury's experience to be me being like largely out of the way. And so for direct exam, especially of a witness who is highly involved in the facts that matter, like I love to be able to just ask, relatively tight questions to signpost and sort of steer the conversation. But I really want to get that person just sort of talking in a natural way so that the jury feels like this person isn't trying to tell me a curated narrative. They're just sort of giving me their impression of what happened. And I think that can be especially valuable when you have witnesses that are maybe in, a little bit of a defensive position based upon sort of how they were involved in the matter. If they can just sort of tell it from their perspective how it is, rather than you steering them, I think the jury is going to find that a lot more credible. Whenever a lawyer's talking too much on direct, I think the jury's like, why is the lawyer telling us what happened, right? They weren't the one who was there.
Mm-hmm. What is your favorite part of trial?
Great question. I mean, winning, obviously, but that doesn't really count. I think there are two pieces that I enjoy the most. One of them is just that it's one of these aspects of our practice that allows you to have incredible community in a way that we don't find is often in this, hybrid work environment. You've got people that are like all in a war room working extremely hard at a singular task. And you're able to like, there's just a bunch of energy there that's really fun. And I also think you end up seeing people grow tremendously. More junior lawyers grow tremendously in that context. So that's one aspect I really like about it. In fact, we even had some folks be like, we should war room more often, right? Like, why do it only for trial? And you even have some more junior lawyers who have sort of enough awareness to be like, this is great for me, right? Because I can learn so much faster if I can just sort of like turn next to me and just like bounce ideas off of somebody. And that's something that's even if you have a good culture about like cold zooming people, like it's not the same. It's just like putting a document in front of somebody and being like, hey, do you think this works? Do you think this is going to cash out? People just don't end up asking those questions in a hybrid environment. So that's one aspect I love about it. And the other aspect I love about it is just sort of like working with the fact witnesses at the client, and sort of there's two aspects about that I really enjoy. One of them is I really enjoy seeing them get invested in the case, right? Because oftentimes the initial reaction, or at least the impression of the lawyer, is going to be like, this engineer or product manager is going to want nothing at all to do with this case. But like oftentimes the very best exams come out when the person is like, look, they're accusing my team of taking their technology and using it improperly. that's insane. My team put in 80-hour weeks on this project for like 3 months, right? Like, I need to step up and defend my team. It's those witnesses who end up in putting on some of the most compelling examinations. And so working with them, seeing them get invested, and then seeing sort of their excitement with the process is really fun. Like, I've had engineers, product managers, other business folks tell me at the end of a trial before the verdict comes in, it's like, hey, if we get sued again, you know where to find me. Like, they're happy to help because like they've seen the process and they really sort of understand how important it is. So I think those are probably the two aspects of trial that I enjoy the most.
Mm-hmm. What's the most surprising thing that's happened at trial?
Good question. I'm not sure if it would surprise me as much these days, but I had a trial now many years ago when I was an associate where it was a pretty technical case. It was a case for Sonoma State University involving environmental, like claims of environmental issues relating to asbestos. And the interesting thing about sort of where we are in Northern California is that asbestos is very much part of the natural environment. like it is in the geology of Northern California. And so and then the other piece of it, which some people sort of have reason to understand and others don't, is that it's also in like basically all the buildings that were made in the 80s because it was just like a really commonly used building material because it's like fire resistant and has a bunch of other great properties. And what was surprising about that case is that we were able to get the jury to like very much understand the science. They would understand, for example, that asbestos that is not airborne is not harmful to you. That's why it was used in building materials. And it ends up being harmful to you if it's airborne because that's how it gets into your lungs where it can be problematic for you. And they also sort of understood like the different forms in which it could take, some of which were sort of more hazardous than others. The judge didn't get it at all. Like if she had been on our jury, that would have been tough. Like this would have been our toughest juror. And so that was surprising to me. I think there was, there seemed to be a bit of a like prejudice coming to the table. Or it might have just been like, well-intentioned skepticism. But it was interesting. In some respects, it was helpful, right? Because like there's a lot of feedback that we got where it's like, oh, maybe we have to sort of like draw out this principle a little bit more. It seems like we haven't gotten across that if a material containing asbestos is wet, it can't be airborne, right? Because the water sort of holds it down and it necessarily can't be airborne in that context. Like, how do we get that across? And how do we get that across in a way where it feels like it comes from a place of authority, right? So that you think about, okay, like how can we lean on the regulations, for example, about how you need to sort of deal with cleaning an asbestos environment as a source of authority so that maybe we can get people to understand that, well, if the regulations say that wetting the materials makes it safe, like I can sort of trust that it's going to make it safe. So that's probably the most surprising situation I had, because I think a lot of times folks think, okay, like I can get the judge to understand it. I do great in a bench trial, but like, how am I going to get the jury to understand this complex subject matter? It was a context in which we sort of had the inverse situation.
And you had a fair amount of state court work earlier in your career. Can you speak to both litigating that form and then also this, non-patent subject matter? What's the legacy of that on your practice today?
Yeah. I did do a fair amount of state court work historically. And it was incredibly helpful from my perspective because, state courts don't have the time constraints that federal courts have most of the time, right? And so this trial that I was just talking about, we were up in Sonoma for 4 months trying this case, as compared to your standard federal trial, which is 5 days usually. And in the context of a 4 month trial, your witness list is like 70 witnesses. And what that means is that as a fifth year associate, I have a trial where I'm down for 10 witnesses, right? I mean, if you were to only do patent litigation, right, I think it'd probably take you a couple of years to get 10 witnesses under your belt. And so it was incredibly helpful in that respect, just in terms of being able to get reps. The other thing that was really helpful is you get data points that allow you to think more outside the box. And what I mean is, in a lot of these state court cases, it is more obvious, for example, how like a third party might end up being a really good trial witness for you. And so you're motivated to go seek out those third parties, see if you can convince them to like go through the burden of showing up for trial, and then sort of work with them to present their testimony in a way where it seems like they're sort of a independent bystander that's going to tell the jury how it is. It's not as obvious sort of how to find those witnesses in patent cases, but if you've been trained to think like that, then it can really pay dividends in the patent context. And so, for example, for this trial I have coming up in front of Judge Gilstrap, one of the witnesses that we'll be calling, or at least who's on our witness list, is the inventor of the 2 patents that are being asserted against our client. Right? I think that's sort of a pretty unusual situation where the accused infringer is calling the inventor, but it's something that we think about in a lot of our cases, in part because a number of us have had the experience doing those state court cases where you have sort of a lot of opportunities to think outside the box.
Mm-hmm. I want to pick up with something early in the conversation when we're talking about the context in which you're making these different predictions about what could happen in the future. You were couching it all in terms of clients, in terms of what clients are looking for, efficiency, and better outcomes. And so I wonder how can you speak to how you think about ultimate client objectives to be efficient? You had shared a story about taking a non-infringement position for a client over filing some IPRs. I think that seems like a good example, but otherwise, like, how do you situate yourself in the shoes of a client and think about what's going to move the needle for being efficient, and then why be efficient?
Yeah. I find it relatively easy to seek the value play, in part because I think I was just sort of socialized to really like a deal. Like when I was growing up, like, and maybe I'm not sure exactly where this came from. I think part of it is just like child of an immigrant mentality, where it's like we're never paying full price for something. We're only going to buy this when it's on sale, and we'll like throw it in the freezer, right? But I'm always looking for a way to get a deal out of something, even if it's defending a patent case, right? And so I take a lot of pleasure in identifying sort of the clean kill, cheap way of getting a walkaway, for example, or sort of getting an early dispositive victory, because it just like it brings me oodles. Like that's part of what I enjoy so much about the practice. And it happens to align very closely with the client objectives of like, how do we get the best results subject to cost? And so I think that's why I do it. I just get independent pleasure from that value play. And I think one way we've been able to do it effectively is by really focusing in on and having enough sort of confidence with respect to singular arguments. Like once you get enough reps, it's easier to advise a client like, look, I think the best play here is forget about those IPRs that are going to cost you, $600,000 a pop. I expect that if we dig into this particular claim limitation, I can't imagine your product operates in the way that they claim it does. Let's go talk to the engineer. We only need, 20 or 30 minutes on her calendar, and I bet we can nail this down. And then we go get that declaration from the engineer. We even often, produce some of the code early. And the reason we do that is so that we can equip the plaintiff with as much exculpatory evidence such that they have to think like, if I litigate this case, am I just going to get rung up for fees? And so I think that, part of it's the reps. Another part of it is just like having relationships with your clients where they have that trust in you, right? Because a lot of times they don't have the bandwidth to make their sort of own independent evaluation. Like, should I be spending the extra $1.2 million on, 2-3 IPRs here? Or are we really going to be okay just going in with a silver bullet on non-infringement? So having that sort of trust in the relationship where they're like, you know what, that seems like a skinny approach, but like, let's do it. Like that helps as well.
And look, it sounds good to be thinking about the client that way, but then also you don't get a trial out of that, right? And so there's, again, with principals and agents, there's inherently tensions to be resolved that are resolvable. But so what's the resolution of why do you want early dispositions? How does that benefit your practice? Yeah.
Great question. It turns out that there doesn't end up being all that much tension for two reasons. One of them is like, I very much see this as a long game. And in order to play the long game, like credibility with your clients is the most important thing. And if you're able to cause them to think, Tim's always going to be looking for the lowest cost way out of this, the lowest cost way to get a win. That just makes their decision making calculus easier. It's easier for them to decide to hire you going forward. So that's one reason. The other reason is just as a bandwidth matter, this job would be impossible if like even a few more cases went to trial. And so like it ends up being really important to sprinkle in dispositive victories and walkaways. I mean, oftentimes we tell associates, you really got to be thinking about filling your plate to 120, 140%, because in litigation, unless you're just losing it every turn, like stuff falls out, right? And so even a couple of months ago, I was talking with this associates like, how are we going to make all these puzzle pieces fit together? It's not working. We're going to have to bring in additional people to help. And then we got like a grant of a motion to dismiss, like killing an entire case on Alice grounds, right? And it's like, that was that like long Tetris piece to come down this side and just like clear out a bunch of bandwidth to focus on some other matters. So I think like bottom line is like, there's absolutely the tension that you identify, but we have a lot of motivation to sort of reconcile those tensions because, I mean, from a basic bandwidth perspective, we need to resolve, the majority's cases short of trial.
And this ties into something we talked before about your business development. So you've done a lot to cultivate clients in Japan. And so one thing I think would be interesting to speak to is why Japan? And then why not have a domestic focus? And then that conversation also spoke to the difference between relationship-driven selection of clients versus reputational. I wonder if you can talk about that as well.
Yeah. So why Japan? Um, I think there's a couple aspects here. I mean, one of them is like it's nice to have cause to sort of have more points of contact with my Japanese ancestry, and the Japan practice has been, great for that, right? It's one of the sort of it's one of the things about coming to MoFo that I probably like didn't anticipate anywhere sort of close to the degree that it would impact my practice. But MoFo has this massive historical presence in Japan. It's got the biggest office of an international law firm in Tokyo, and that really allowed me to sort of go out to Japan and sell a U.S. litigation practice to these Japanese companies who, occasionally find themselves sued here. They're not being sued here to the extent they were back in the, 80s and 90s, where Japanese consumer electronics were, everywhere. We've definitely in the U.S. had sort of a realignment where the big consumer electronics players are primarily Korean and Chinese now. But it's nevertheless been a nice way to sort of have that connection with my Japanese ancestry. Additionally, it's just, it provides a different dimension to my practice that has allowed me to sort of work on skills that aren't as critical in the U.S. practice. And so some of it is just like there's way more formality in dealing with Japanese companies. That it's sort of California software companies are sort of on the opposite end of the spectrum. And sort of exercising those muscles, I think, it's been interesting for me, and in part because I just like doing new things. But I think it's also going to be helpful, sort of as I work with, companies that are more in the high tech space rather than in software space, because there's this whole spectrum of formality. And then additionally, it's got me sort of in this mode where I have to think about international dynamics a lot more. And so, for example, juries have, impressions about foreign companies. And I think that's especially prominent in today's environment where a lot of the political discussion involves like, okay, the job market for manufacturing in the United States has become very difficult because foreign companies are taking it away and offshoring things. Now, Japan isn't nearly as prominent in that discussion, in part because they've for long been an ally of the United States, and additionally, I don't think they are typically thought of as a country that's undercutting U.S. labor. Nevertheless, like if you look at sort of classic manufacturing industry in the United States, take the automotive space, for example, Japan's clearly one of the biggest competitors. And so you do have to be mindful of that sort of dynamic, and just like thinking on that additional dimension, I find to be really interesting in terms of the trial presentation. And then the last piece is there's the additional complication of dealing with interpreted testimony. That's something that is relatively infrequent these days, especially in patent cases, because English has become so prominent in the developed world. But in Japan, it's still pretty uncommon for people to speak fluent English, even in business. And so that's yet another additional dimension that I've just had to sort of figure out how to work with. And so it brings more sort of diversity to my practice in a way that I've enjoyed.
Can I ask about what you've talked about so far? Because what I'm hearing is these are all, you find these interesting. They're also hard. And on the last point, does that create a moat? Is that some of the context?
Good point. Good point. I do think there's a bit of a moat with respect to the Japan practice. And a lot of it relates to sort of having the necessary cultural awareness, because again, Japanese business culture is very different than US business culture. And then the second piece that creates a moat is language. One reason I'm able to have this practice is that I have phenomenal colleagues in Tokyo who are US qualified litigators, but who are completely bilingual. I think it'd be very challenging, sort of near impossible, to sort of do this practice in a fluid way without having those sorts of colleagues.
And then can you speak to you flagged as between Japanese business culture and US business culture, in Japan, it's more relational, and the US our legal market is more reputational. Can you talk some more about that and implications of that?
Totally. Yeah, the way one way I think about it is that in Japan, like, there's a really long dating process oftentimes with clients. There's sort of this tradition of meeting with prospective clients, a couple times a year, so they can get to know you better, so that you can sort of develop trust, before they're going to want to hire you for a bigger matter. And sort of the flip side of that is there tends to be more stickiness. There's, and I think you can think about the stickiness by talking about, what the US approach is, especially if you think about, SaaS companies. With them, oftentimes they're like, I've got, 10, 20, 40 patent litigations going at any given time. Like, I need a stable of like law firms to help with this, and I need data on what's good there in the market. And so they're often willing to try out a new lawyer, to your point, especially if they have a strong reputation, because from their perspective, it's relatively low cost, right? Like, they're sophisticated enough that if things aren't working out well with that new lawyer, they can either sort of manage that situation within this particular case or bring on a different lawyer to do that case. But they're much more willing to try out someone completely new. And so you're right, reputation matters a lot in that sort of environment. But it also means there's like a whole lot more opportunity. And you don't have to have this longer term dating process. A lot of times, like, I've had situations where, I might know someone through a mutual contact and essentially do a cold outreach and say, like, I've litigated against this plaintiff before. We got this result. I have this idea about how you should be able to win this case early. You'll have people that will take you up on that and just be like, that sounds great. Let's give it a try. And so, I find that fun too. I mean, in some respects, it's a lot more dynamic in the U.S. context, where it doesn't take sort of that long-term relationship building to get hired for a client for the first time.
Yeah, it seems like the two systems have pretty even benefits and costs. I think I probably, just by virtue of having trained in this country, I think I relate more to the reputational approach, and it's I think I'm drawn to businesses where the market is highly fragmented, because that means you can enter easily. But the flip side is that as an incumbent, you have less hold on things.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems to me very meritocratic, and that's that more resonates with me. But I mean, relationships are a form of meritocracy too. Like, you form relationships, and that's a skill. So I think both have pretty even benefits and costs. Can you speak to, as you've developed more understanding of Japanese business culture, what's something in the last year or so that's been a new insight about Japanese business culture, how they think about technology disputes, What's new in your understanding and perception of Japanese clients?
Yeah. This isn't super new, but it is, I mean, new relative to what my practice was like before working with Japanese companies. Like, I'm used to doing work for software and high tech companies where people bounce around, like engineers bounce around every 2 to 3 years. And what that means is that it's pretty rare that you have somebody at the company who like developed your own company's prior art to the asserted patent, right? It just almost never happens. And, you know, it's more often the case that your witnesses will not be around at the company for trial than they are to be around. With Japanese companies, it's like the complete opposite. You often have people who have been at the company for their entire careers, right out of college. And actually, it just sort of helps you get this information that you wouldn't have access to before. Additionally, I think you're able to put on more of a narrative about how like this company must be so great and so good to its people that like everybody sort of wishes to stay here. So it does impact the trial presentation quite a bit. And one thing just to be mindful of in these cases is it is worth investing more in identifying, you know, whether there are folks at the company who developed the accused technology even before the priority date of the asserted patents. We do that in all our cases, but it's a lot more likely to have payoff at these Japanese clients where you have a lot of people who've been there 20, 30, 40 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting.
The other dynamic, the other thing that's unique about Japanese practice is, in contrast to U.S. in-house legal departments, there's often a patent group that's distinct from the legal group. It's full of people who I think in sort of U.S. parlance we call patent engineers, who aren't necessarily legally qualified, but they're extremely sophisticated about patent merits, including about how things cash out in U.S. litigation. That has been really interesting because it's been fun to have sort of someone within the company who can be a real partner in digging in on the technical merits, and sort of like finding the sort of subject matter experts within the company who could be your witness or who could help sort of figure out how this very finite detail in the firmware works, right? It's a different dynamic that I've found to be fun and interesting.
Let's say you're to switch gears and focus on domestic practice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How would you take the skills you've acquired, experiences you acquired in developing your Japanese clientele? How would that differentiate you from somebody who would only ever focus on domestic practice?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that perhaps the biggest payoff is just like the way the Japanese practice causes you to think a lot more about building long-term relationships. And I think sort of on a surface level, you can imagine thinking like, does that really matter as much as in the U.S. practice? We're just talking about how, it's more of a meritocracy. People will hire you even if they don't know you that well, et cetera, et cetera. I think notwithstanding that, the long-term relationships are still critically important because even though people are bouncing around, they're often just going to like other software companies that you probably want to work with as well. And so if you're able to sort of focus energy on really building those deep personal relationships, it can actually be really fruitful in terms of broadening your client profile because like these people start pollinating other companies. And if they've had a really good experience with you, in part because you've taken the time to really understand what that human cares about, it allows you to retain that work even after they've gone elsewhere.
So we talked earlier about your experience in state court, and a lot of that I think happened at you were in a boutique that came over to MoFo, a team that came over to MoFo from this boutique. And I think one of the most persistent things that I see in patent litigation at all seniorities is a mutual fascination from lawyers at boutiques about general practice, as patent litigators, this is, and conversely, patent litigators at general practice firms about boutiques. And I think both kind of fantasize together the one as, the greener pasture. And of course, there's strengths to both, but you're uniquely situated to speak about the roles these play. So I wonder, if you can compare would have been like, for you, you came up, in key part through boutique and now a general practice firm. How do you think your experience would differ if you had flipped that?
Great question. With, I think, obvious caveat that your mileage is going to vary a bunch depending on which particular boutique you're at and which particular general practice firm you're at. It is hard to imagine that I would have gotten nearly as much early experience at a general practice firm. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. One of them is at Dury Tongri, there were between 10 to 12 partners at any given time. And when you have like that small a population of decision makers, it's a lot easier to optimize for non-monetary things that people value. It's harder to get consensus if you've got, 200, 300, 400 partners. And so one thing the firm really prioritized that I benefited tremendously from is the firm would often think like, what are some cases that we could take on that would help our associates develop really quickly, even if they're not going to make the firm a ton of money, or even if like they're barely going to make the firm money, right? You can do that when you've got 10 to 12 stakeholders, where their preferences are such that like they all really value seeing people grow. And so that's why we ended up doing cases like that trial up in Sonoma that was 4 months long. We were willing to sort of place bets on sort of investing in human capital rather than necessarily investing in revenue. I think the other thing is the conflicts profiles is completely different. It hasn't sort of moving to a bigger platform hasn't impacted me quite as much as other folks in the life sciences space, where you end up seeing more tension. But at Dury Tongri, we didn't have a corporate practice, right? And so just the number of clients we had was significantly more constrained, and you had a much more open conflicts profile. And then I think the last piece I'll highlight is from a recruiting perspective. It is much easier to have a differentiated proposition if you're at a boutique. There just are way fewer places that look like you, and they can present the same sort of narrative to law students. One thing that I think was especially unique about Dury Tongri is that for some time, we paid below market. And so we had a very explicit pitch that was like, we pay below market, and the reason we do that is because the firm as a whole, like not just the partners here, but everyone here has decided we care more about sort of opportunity than necessarily sort of maximizing dollars. And so what we were able to do is use that as a bit of a filter to get people coming out of law school who had a primary focus on just developing as quickly as they can, and weren't like the sorts that are like, I'm going to go to a law firm for 3 years, pay off my loan, go do something different. So it was incredibly helpful from a recruiting perspective. The last piece on recruiting is like, we can be like, look, we're a 25-person law firm when we had 3 trials this year. You just like, you don't end up getting that hit rate, like the per capita hit rate at most places. So that was another very differentiated proposition we were able to sell. And then in terms of the bigger platform, there's just, from my perspective, there's just like a different set of benefits. One of them is something we touched on earlier. It's like, you can have global practice. There's no way I could have had a Japanese practice back at Dury Tangri. We didn't have the presence in Japan. We didn't have the bilingual litigators, and it goes on and on. I think the other tremendously nice thing about a platform like MoFo's is you can provide clients with like an integrated experience across a bunch of adjacent areas that just makes life better for the client. And so oftentimes I'll have cases where like you have an opportunity to resolve a thing through like a quasi business team. And being able to bring in our tech transactions lawyers early on in that process, it like allows the client to even like scope those possibilities in a way that we didn't really have the depth to do at Dury Tangri.
Can you say more? What do you mean by that? What do you mean resolve the matter through a corporate tech transaction?
Yeah, so like even in a patent case, one way to resolve the case might be like, should we be working together? Should we, the plaintiff and the defendant, be working together instead of against each other? And so that may be an M&A transaction, it may be a joint venture, what have you. But like, unless you have the tech transactions lawyers who can think in a sophisticated way about sort of like, how do we partner while still protecting our core IP? Right, and the client's really sensitized to that because they're in litigation with the other party, right? So they're like, I definitely need to protect my core IP, but there's all this sort of business upside, and like you're just able to explore that in a much more robust way with the sort of tech transactions practice that MoFo has. I mean, to be clear, I'd occasionally do that at Dury Tangri. But what happened when I needed to do that is I actually worked with Billy Schwartz at MoFo for that. There were a couple situations where it's like, look, we just need tech transactions expertise here, and then Billy, who's sort of one of the very best in the business, like he was able to come in and help out with that piece of things. So it's doable at a boutique. But I think you can start that process much earlier at a platform like MoFo because there's less friction in bringing somebody like Billy in.
What do you think your practice would be like if you never joined MoFo? If Dury Tangri kept on going, what do you think your practice looked like today?
Yeah. Great question. You know, I'm not sure it would be all that different outside of the Japan piece, just in terms of the client mix, the type of cases I'm doing, et cetera, et cetera. And that's in part because in the sort of final years of Dury Tangri, we were sort of presented with this inflection point where it's like, okay, we've got a number of people who have practices that require leverage. And we were presented with a decision basically of like, do we change our leverage model here at the boutique to be able to support those people's practices? Or do we go do that at a different firm that's already sort of built that machine? Obviously an additional option would have been like, or we just keep our leverage as it is and we don't support those people's practices. But like, none of us was really interested in that, right? We cared about each other's practices. Bottom line is, like, I think had we not come to MoFo, we would have endeavored to sort of higher to increase leverage and make it look more like a big firm leverage model in order to support the practices that people were developing. And so assuming we were successful in growing like that, and that's an assumption, but if we were successful in growing like that, I think the practice would look fairly similar, setting aside the Japan piece, which I think truly would have been impossible at the boutique.
Can you speak to the role of institutional clients, what you see as the role of them in a practice? Because I think you can have different points of view on this. I'm always mindful of trade-offs. And so on one hand, it just seems like, oh, that's perfect. Like who wouldn't with these marquee clients that have high stakes disputes and so forth. But I think one answer to one trade-off to that is, the proverbial pie eating contest, where then you're really locked into servicing that client and you have to keep on servicing that client to sustain them. How do you think about the role of large clients with ongoing needs? You mentioned these clients that have hey, I've got 8 to 20 matters or whatever. How do you think about those kinds of clients in your mix versus the relationship approach? You've got the meritocratic reputational approach. How do institutional clients fit into that in your practice?
Yeah. So I think they're incredibly helpful to have for just having sort of a consistent sort of baseline of work that you can reasonably expect to have. To be clear, the relationship requires continued focus. However, if it's one of these clients that's being sued in patent litigation routinely, I think you can sort of count on a relative baseline amount of work. On the other hand, I think it's really important to be quite diversified. I mean, we this is something we were very focused on while at Dury Tangri, right? Because we have these reports that are who are our top 10 clients. And one thing we really liked about what we had sort of managed at Dury Tangri is that the list of top 10 clients would change dramatically year over year. And to us, that was incredibly healthy because as a 25-person shop, we didn't want to be so invested in one single client because things change. GCs get replaced, companies get acquired, or all sorts of different dynamics happen, and we always wanted to make sure that we were well diversified. And I think the other sort of reason I like the diversification is because I have found that with true startup clients, pre-public startup clients, especially in the software case, those are often the clients that sort of allow associates to have the broadest range of stand-up opportunities. And so it's helped a lot from the perspective of just being able to get my associates trial witnesses, dispositive motion hearings, and so on and so forth. And I think it's a sort of pretty natural dynamic. If you've been hired by a company whose founders are 22 because they started their company when they dropped out of their first year of undergrad, their perspective is, I want someone good litigating my case. I don't really care sort of how old you are, right? If I can tell that you're a true specialist and you're going to do the preparation necessary to do something well. So that's another reason why I prefer to have the diverse client mix.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned things changing, and that's a good thing. So what do you think will change the most about your practice a year?
I think this takes us back to the top of our conversation. I think there is going to be dramatic uptake in the use of AI in cases, not just in terms of the work that sort of we're doing for our clients, but in terms of how the other side's litigating. I do tend to think that for, copyright plaintiffs, for example, who are filing all these class actions against the generative AI companies, it'll be a lot easier to just like generate new complaints, generate deposition outlines, generate, you know, offensive discovery, generate like discovery letters, right? All of that. Like they'll be able to do it much more efficiently, and therefore, like, unless we are adopting AI use, it's just going to drive up dramatically the cost of litigation for our clients. And so that I think is really the thing that I expect to change the most over the next year. And as we touched on earlier, I'm excited about sort of figuring out ways to make sure that we are ahead of the curve with respect to that dynamic.
I don't know how you'll answer this, but do you relate more to being, this is another ongoing conversation across lawyers. Do you relate more to being strategic or opportunistic? Because the way you're talking about what might change the practice, you can argue that it's either one. How do you think about, what do you think has been the story of your practice so far? And has that changed? Are you different in that way now?
Great question. I think it depends on sort of what level of granularity you're looking at. Sort of big picture, if you look at the arc of my career, I think opportunistic is the more appropriate label. Like, as an associate, I once like learned from local counsel at like 8 p.m. the night before a hearing that, oh, this judge like really likes junior lawyers to argue. And so even though the partner was already in Dallas for the hearing the next day, like I got on kayak and found an overnight flight that would get me to Dallas so I could go argue this transfer motion.
Wow.
And so
can we talk more about that decision? Okay, was that easy for you to do?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, like, to be fair, it was like pre-kids. I didn't have to make arrangements, right? Like other than like, figuring out which flight would actually get me there. But like that was an easy calculus, right? Like I was going to incur some short-term pain from like, having very little sleep from taking the red eye, but like I was going to get a hearing out of this, right? So that was totally worth it. And then that's sort of an extreme example, but there's like a variety where it's like, hey, I'm going to have to push myself to 140% to like jump on this opportunity. Especially sort of earlier on in my career, I always found that to be a relatively easy decision to make. The opportunities come up, especially sort of now, they come up relatively episodically. So I think you just got to prepare yourself to be able to jump. And it's I guess, going back to your strategic point or thinking strategically about things, like you can sort of marry being strategic and opportunistic if you can figure out ways to set up your life such that you're like positioned to jump on those opportunities when they arrive.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's poker, and I've played very little of it. It's also Sotos and Catan, which I played a little more of. Yeah, so I really resonate with that approach. And I'm sure many of the people listening to the episode will too.
Right. And then within cases, I think of myself as a strategist. Like that's what I really, really enjoy. When sometimes people are like, what do you like about this job? Especially when I'm talking to non-lawyers. What I usually say is like, you're so often playing 3D chess. You're like optimizing across like 7 different axes that all interrelate, and sort of that complex decision tree. You're trying to figure out like how to pull on various levers to force your adversary down a particular path. That's one of the things I enjoy most about this job. So that's why I said at the top, depends on what level of granularity you're thinking about. Within a case, I see myself as a strategist, but sort of at a more macro level, I would describe myself more as someone who's opportunistic.
Fascinating. Thanks for not saying it depends.
You bet. I try to avoid that. I find, as it turns out, like clients find that to be a pretty annoying answer.
Tim, this is a great episode. Thanks for taking the time to break down your practice. It's really fascinating. I appreciate all the subtleties. This is definitely an episode I'd like to revisit.
Well, thank you. This has been a really fun conversation. It's been great to have occasion to think hard about a number of these issues, and really appreciate the time.